The death penalty and sentence of life in prison are judgments which ensure that an offender will never be able to rejoin civil society. There is no question that anyone who commits crimes should be held accountable and punished. But are punishments such as death penalty and sentence of life fair sentences for a person who committed the crimes as a child before turning the age of 18 years? According to the Penal Code, Section 53 states that no person under 18 years of age can be sentenced to death. However, in Sri Lanka, when an offender who has crossed the 18-year threshold between the date of the offence and the date of conviction, culpability is judged without taking reference to the offender's age at the time of committing the offence. That means, despite the offenders being children at the time of offences, the punishment is all too often no different from those given to adults. This practice for children falls short of international best practices and also causes grave injustice for child offenders. The Daily Mirror through this article delves into the question of how just our justice system is for such child offenders. The definition of the child is vital for providing the necessary protection to children and for protecting the rights specific to children. However, the international law and the domestic law have confusing and conflicting ideas about defining a child. There is no single legal definition of the state of being a child in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan law recognizes three categories, namely children as those who are under the age of 14, then the juveniles as those who are between the ages 14 and 16 and the young persons as those who are between 16 and 22 years. This interpretation is contrary to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child definition, where a child is defined to be less than 18 years of age. Since Sri Lanka has ratified the UN Convention, the country is bound to comply with its provisions. The Daily Mirror is in possession of several cases where inmates who have been given death penalty for crimes committed at an age when they are not even considered responsible enough to drive, marry, vote, leave school, live away from their parents, or sign a contract.
නිසි කාලේ නඩුව ඇහුවා නම් අවුරුද්ද දෙකක් ඇතුළත මේ ළමයි පවතින නීතියටවත් එළඹ ගන්න යවන්න බෑ. මේ බරපතල අසාධාරණ මේක හදන්න පුළුවන්. මේක හැදීම සඳහා මම දෙකින් දිගටම මේ අවධානය යොමු කරන බල හැම ආයතනයකම අවධානය යොමු කරා. අගමැති ජනාධිපතිතුමාට ලිව්වා, අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයට ලිව්වා, නීතිපතිතුමාට ලිව්වා. ඒ කාගෙන්වත් අවශ්‍ය සහනයක් ලැබුණේ ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨ අධිකරණය. මේගොල්ලෝ මම මේ සාක්ෂි එහෙම කිව්වල බැලුවා. මේගොල්ලෝ කරපු වරදක් නෙවෙයි, කරපු අපරාධයක් නෙවෙයි. පවුලක වැඩි හිටිය දෙනෙක් රණ්ඩු වෙනකොට ඒ ටිකස යනවා ගෙදර ඉන්න පොඩි උන්. උන්ටත් මරණය දඬුවම නියම කරනවා අන්ලෝෆුල් ඇසෙම්බලි නැත්නම් මේ නීති විරෝධී රාජ්‍ය ගෙහිම කියන පදනම. එහෙම නියම කරපුවා. මේක සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම රටේ නීතියට පටහැනි දෙයක්. දඬු නිසංග්‍රහය කියනවා 50 වෙනි වගන්තියේ අවුරුදු 18ට කිසිම කෙනෙක් මරණය දඬුවම නියම කළේ නැහැ කියලා. ඒ වගේම අපේ ආණ්ඩුව ජාත්‍යන්තර සංවිධානත් එක්ක එක්සත් ජාතික සංවිධානය සංකල්ප ළමයි චෝදන ප්‍රඥප්තියට අනුව ළමයි සම්බන්ධයෙන් අනුගමනය කරන බීජින් රූල්ස් වලට අනුව වයස අවුරුදු 18ට අඩු කිසිම කෙනෙකුට මරණීය දඬුවම වරද කරන කාලේ වයස අවුරුදු 18ට අඩු හිටියනම් ඒ පුද්ගලයාට මරණීය දඬුවම හෝ ජීවිතාන්තය දක්වා කෙරෙනවා දෙන්න බෑ ඒ ප්‍රඥප්තිය. මේ නීතිය ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්නේ මොකක්ද අපි අසංකරපු ජාත්‍යන්තර ප්‍රඥප්තිය සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම අමුමම උල්ලංඝනය කරනවා. මම මේක දැනගත්ත ගමන් මම මේ කාරණේ කරාම ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨාධිකරණය හැමෝට මූලික අයිතිවාසිකම් නඩුවක ස්වරූපයෙන් එතෙන්දී නීතිපතිතුමාගේ මතය උනේ මොකද්ද? මේගොල්ලන්ට දැන් දඬුවම් කරන කාලේ වයස 18 සම්පූර්ණ වෙන මේ වරදක් නැහැ.
In Section 53 of the Penal Code, does not recognize the distinction between the age at the time of the conviction and the age at the time of the commission of the offense.
නීති වෙනස් කරන කටයුතු නීතිපති කරන්න පුළුවන් කටයුත්ත. අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයට කරන්න පුළුවන් කටයුත්ත. මේක කවුරුත් මේක කරන්නේ නැහැ. කරන්නේ නැති හින්දා මම මේ ගැන අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයට ලියුම් ගණනාවක්. එතනින් උත්තරයක් නැති හින්දා මම ජනාධිපතිතුමාට ලියුවා. නීති කොමිසම සභාවත් මේක අද වෙනකන් කරලා නැහැ. නීති කොමිසම සභාවේ සභාපතිතුමා හමුණා, ලේකම්තුමිය හමුණා. ඒ සියලු දෙනාට මම ලියවිලි දුන්නා. ඒ විතරක් නෙවෙයි ඒගොල්ලෝ මට කිව්වා නීති කොමිසමට වැඩි මේක කරගන්න බෑ කියලා. එහෙම කිව්වට පස්සේ මම ඒ මගෙන් කිව්වා ඉල්ලීම කරේ වගන්ති 4 දෙන්නේ කියලා. මම ඒකත් කළා දුන්නා. 2016 අවුරුද්ද. මේ 2020යි අවුරුදු 4ක් ගත වෙලා තියෙනවා. අද වෙනකම් මේ සංශෝධනය කළා නෑ. මම විතරක් නෙවෙයි ජනාධිපතිතුමාත් සමාගයේ ලියුම් වලින් අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයට ලියලා තියෙනවා. මේ තියෙන ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ අන්තෝරිය ලියුම් මේ මෛත්‍රීපාල සිරිසේන 2016 ඔක්තෝබර් මාසේ 24 වෙනිදා ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ ලේකම් ලියවන ලියන්නේ ලේකම් අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයට මේක කරන්නයි කියලා. ඒක කරන්නේ නැහැ. තව ලියමනක් ඒත් යවලා තියෙන ලේකම් අධිකරණ අමාත්‍යාංශයෙන් පිටපතක් මට එවලා තියෙනවා. මේගොල්ලෝ මිනිස්සු දුක් වේදනාවෙන් සංවේදී. මේ නිලධාරී මේ රටේ ජනතාව හැබැයි ප්‍රශ්න පිළිබඳව සංවේදී. ඒකේ ඉඳලා අපි හිරගවල් පිරලා තියෙන්නේ. සෑහෙන පිරිසක් ඉන්න හිරගවල් වල දඬුවමක් වරදක් නැතුව දඬුවම් දෙන මිනිස්සු. නීති විරෝධී විදිහට ඉන්න සෑහෙන ප්‍රමාණයක්.
In most of the cases, the convicts, as children, suffered significant trauma being victims of abuse or neglect, and witnessing domestic violence. Moreover, discoveries of neuroscientists have revealed that the human brain involved in decision-making is not fully developed until after age 18. Meanwhile, we interviewed one of the few forensic psychologists in Sri Lanka.
When do we decide that children deserve adult punishment, right? So for an example, how it currently happens is that you look at the crime and then you be like, according to the book, this is the punishment that this crime deserves. So you'll be like, you don't take any other factors into consideration. You'll be like, yeah, you deserve this punishment because you committed this crime. So when I say other factors, what kind of factors am I talking about? So there are individual factors, there are societal factors, and there are of course the biological factors. So for biological factors, it could be that there is a history of crime, which of course doesn't like excuse you, but then it gives you a better understanding as to why this person may have been exposed to certain contexts, would be learning certain behaviors, would normalize violence. So because of that, it could be that necessarily they don't understand what they've done is wrong, because for them committing that crime was a normal behavior because that's the context that they grew up in. And then you have the societal factors. So it could be that they're exposed to violence, it could be that they're exposed to drugs, it could be that they're exposed to antisocial peers. So because of that, those factors have normalized violence for them. So we don't take that into consideration either. And then most importantly, you have the individual factors, which could be that maybe they have mental health difficulties. So as far as I know, it's so rare that the Sri Lankan law system take that into consideration. And especially like when it comes to young offenders, before the age of, children in general, before the age of 18, they are not given a diagnosis. So that's the general ethical practice, that psychiatrists or psychologists do not give them a diagnosis. So without given a diagnosis, they are not given medication for whatever the mental health difficulties that they might be facing. Just because they are not given a diagnosis, unless it's severe, of course, they are given a diagnosis and medication. But then mental health professionals try their best not to medicate children or impose undue stress on them with therapy and other forms of rehabilitation methods. So just because a child is not given a diagnosis doesn't mean that they don't have mental health difficulties. So it could be that at the time that they were committing the crime, they may have had mental health difficulties or like an episode, or maybe they actually knew if they were doing it, or maybe they didn't know. So that's where the criminal, you need to question the criminal responsibility of a child because if someone has had a mental health difficulty at the time that they committed the crime, legally they shouldn't be held responsible, or even if they are held responsible, it could be partially, and they would be given a lesser severe sentence. So in the Sri Lankan context, to the best of my knowledge, it doesn't happen to that extent. Yes, if it is like a very popular case or a very severe case, like a psychologist or a psychiatrist would be asked for their expert opinion. But I think every person, whether you are an adult or you are a child, you deserve to have that service. So once you go to court, you deserve to be assessed by a psychologist. A psychologist should be, or a psychiatrist should be given the opportunity to present their findings or present their expert opinion on you as a person in relation to the crime to the judge or to the lawyer. And then of course this expert person would be cross-examined, so it's not like it's a very biased opinion.
She also talked about the importance of rehabilitation of inmates.
How about for a change, we have rehabilitation programs inside. Let them understand why they committed the crime. Let them understand the gravity of their crime. Let them understand how to control their emotions, their actions, their cognitive thoughts, so that they don't commit this crime again. Because like what Sri Lanka tried to do with punishment is to make sure they don't commit a crime. But research has proven that punishment does not help with recidivism. By recidivism, what I mean is that someone committing a crime again.
Example from another country. In a series of landmark decisions, the United States Supreme Court ruled that children must be sentenced differently. In 2012, the court held that juvenile life sentences were unconstitutional and the government is required to consider the unique circumstances of each juvenile defendant in determining an individualized sentence. As a result, juveniles sentenced to life in 29 states and the federal government are now in the process of having their original sentences reviewed, or have been granted a new sentence.